Sid, you have 10 minutes. If you're not here by then, I'm throwing her out the window.
Few actors brought as much warmth and wit to Hollywood as George Segal, the charming, quick-talking star whose career spanned over 6 decades. From Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf to The Goldbergs, Segal's mix of humor and humanity made him unforgettable. But behind the laughter and Hollywood glow, George carried a lifetime of quiet burdens, secrets that even his closest friends never knew. When he passed away at 87, tributes poured in from across the world. Fans remembered his sharp one-liners and timeless smile, while colleagues praised his professionalism and kindness. Yet it wasn't until 2 years later, on what would have been his 89th birthday, that his widow, Sonia Segal, broke her silence, revealing a confession George had made in his final days. According to Sonia, George had spent his last moments not talking about fame or regrets, but something deeper, something he'd held on to since the early days of his career. A truth that changed how she, and the world, would remember him forever. Her words stunned even those who had known him for decades. It wasn't about scandal or fame. It was about the man behind the actor, the choices that haunted him, and the forgiveness he'd been seeking all along. This is the story of George Segal's final confession, a tale of love, loss, redemption, and the startling honesty of a man who had nothing long before his final confession. George Segal was one of those rare stars who could light up a room just by walking into it. Born in 1934 in Great Neck, New York, he grew up during the Great Depression, but his spirit was anything but bleak. From an early age, George was drawn to performance, not for fame, but for connection. "I loved the feeling of making people smile," he once said. It was like magic. After studying at Columbia University and serving in the U.S. Army, Segal began chasing his dream in the 1950s, when Hollywood was bursting with new energy. Television was booming, cinema was evolving, and George, with his disarming grin and easy charisma, fit right in. But it wasn't until the 1960s that he truly became a household name. His breakthrough came with Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, 1966, opposite Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. It was a volatile, emotional film, and George's portrayal of Nick earned him an Academy Award nomination. Suddenly, he wasn't just a supporting actor, he was a leading man. His talent for blending humor with vulnerability made him one of the most sought-after stars of the 1970s. Films like A Touch of Class, The Owl and the Pussycat, and Fun with Dick and Jane turned him into Hollywood's go-to everyman. Charming, flawed, and real. But while audiences saw a man full of confidence and charm, behind the camera, George wrestled with something much deeper. Fame, he discovered, was both a blessing and a curse. "You start believing your own legend," he later admitted. And that's when you start losing yourself. By the late 1970s, as his career soared, his personal life began to crumble. His first marriage to film editor Marion Sobel ended in divorce, followed by years of inner struggle. He was drinking more, smiling less, and hiding his pain behind the same humor that made him famous. George could make anyone laugh, one co-star recalled. But sometimes you could see in his eyes that he wasn't laughing inside. Even in those turbulent years, his performances never faltered. He reinvented himself in the 1990s with roles in Just Shoot Me, and later The Goldbergs, where he became beloved to a new generation as the witty, lovable Grandpa Pops. His humor remained intact, but those close to him noticed he often retreated into quiet reflection between takes. To the public, he was timeless, the man who never seemed to age, who never lost that glimmer in his eyes. But privately, he carried regret for the bridges he'd burned and the people he'd hurt along the way. In his later years, George began speaking more openly about forgiveness, not just of others, but of himself. "You spend half your life chasing success," he said once, "and the other half trying to understand what it cost you." By the time he met Sonia Segal, his third wife and final love, George had mellowed. She brought calm to his chaos, patience to his impulsiveness. Together, they found comfort in the quiet, far away from cameras and scripts. But even then, there were moments when Sonia sensed something lingering in him, a story untold, a guilt unspoken, And in his final days, when the spotlight had long dimmed, George finally chose to share that truth. A confession not about fame, but about the heart. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 2, 55G Left to Hide? In the quiet of their California home, as the world slowed around him, George Segal began reflecting on a lifetime lived in the public eye. His body was weaker now, his voice softer, but his mind remained sharp and haunted. In his final weeks, his wife Sonia noticed him slipping into long silences, staring out the window as if replaying old reels of his life. When she asked what he was thinking, he'd smile faintly and say, "Just remembering what I should have said long ago." Sonia didn't press at first. George had always been a private man beneath the charm, an actor who shared everything on screen but very little off it. Yet something about his tone was different now. He wasn't reminiscing for nostalgia's sake. He was preparing for something, unburdening himself before the end. One evening, as the sun set over the Pacific, George finally opened up. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for hers. "Sonia," he whispered, "there's something I need you to know. Something I've carried with me for too long." He spoke slowly, his eyes glistening not with fear, but with relief. He told her about a decision he'd made decades earlier, one that haunted him through every stage of his success. It wasn't a scandal or a betrayal in the Hollywood sense. It was something far more personal. Early in his career, when fame first came calling, George had made a choice that shattered a relationship he deeply valued, one with a woman who had believed in him long before he was famous. Her name was Linda, a stage actress he'd met in New York when they were both struggling artists. They'd shared small apartments, late-night rehearsals, and dreams of stardom. But when George's career took off, he left her behind, not out of malice but ambition. "I told myself it was for the best," he said softly. That she'd understand. But she didn't. And neither did I. Linda passed away years later without ever reconnecting with him. George had reached out, written letters that were never sent, apologies that remained unsaid. Every award, every laugh, they all reminded me of what I lost, he admitted. "I built a life, but part of my heart stayed in that little apartment in New York." Sonia listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. She had always sensed there was a shadow in him, not one of scandal but of sorrow. "George," she said gently, "you were young." "You didn't know," but George shook his head. "I did know. I just didn't listen. I thought success would fill the hole, but it never did." That night, he asked Sonia to find an old photo he had kept tucked inside a drawer, a faded black-and-white picture of him and Linda laughing on a city street. He held it close, staring at it for a long moment. "She believed in the best version of me," he said. "I just hope I finally became that man." For Sonia, this was more than a confession. It was a revelation. George wasn't seeking forgiveness from her or anyone else. He was forgiving himself, finally setting down the weight he'd carried for over 50 years. When he finished speaking, he looked peaceful, the kind of peace that only comes when truth is finally spoken aloud. "Thank you for listening," he whispered. "Now I can rest." That night, as Sonia sat beside him, she realized his confession wasn't about regret alone. It was about redemption, about the courage to face one's past before the curtain falls. After George's confession, the atmosphere in their home shifted. It was as though the walls themselves could finally breathe again. For years, Sonia Segal had known her husband as the witty, charming, and endlessly gracious man adored by millions. Yet in those final conversations, she began to see the George no one else had, the man behind the legend, stripped of performance and pretense. In the days that followed his admission, George seemed lighter, almost boyish at times. He laughed more, talked about small memories, the kind that never made it into interviews. He'd sit by the fireplace recalling old film sets and forgotten moments from his youth. "You know," he said one evening, "people remember the roles, the awards, the fame, but the real story is always between the takes." Sonia listened as he reflected on his life in layers. The career highs, the quiet heartbreaks, the near misses that shaped him. I wasn't the best husband, he confessed. Sometimes I was too focused on what came next to appreciate what I already had. It was a rare kind of honesty, not bitter, but tender. He wasn't trying to rewrite history. He was finally at peace with it. To the public, George Segal had always been effortlessly likable, that rare star who made success look easy. But Sonia knew it had never been easy. He'd battled insecurities, career slumps, and the nagging feeling that Hollywood's love was always conditional. When roles slowed down in the 1980s, he feared he'd been forgotten. "One day you're everyone's favorite," he once said. "And the next, they're already calling someone else the next big thing." What kept him going through those uncertain years was his love for storytelling. Even when he wasn't acting, George kept his guitar close, playing old jazz tunes late into the night. "Music never judged me," he'd joke. "It just listened." After his confession about Linda, Sonia began,